This is a small safe I made. And when I made it, I didn't want some lock picker or safe cracker to be able to open it without me ever being the wiser. But literally every lock that is commercially available can be lockpicked. So the universe kind of forced my hand there, and I had to make an unpickable lock myself. And because I firmly believe in the principle of least action, I made it incredibly simple by building a mechanism around an existing lock to make that lock unpickable. But before I get into how my mechanism actually works, I'll quickly explain how locks and lockpicking work, because I assume not every single one of you is omniscient. And to better explain, I have a cross-section of a pin tumbler lock made out of an old wine box. In a pin tumbler lock, as you might expect, there's pins. And each pin, as you can see here, is actually made of two little pins. And these pins have to be pushed up to the exact right height to allow the cylinder to rotate. This job is normally done by putting a piece of metal into the cylinder that pushes each pin stack to the exact right height to allow the cylinder to rotate. Now, if you don't have that piece of metal, occasionally called a key, you don't know to what height to push each pin. And there's thousands of possible combinations, and only one works. It's like finding a needle in a haystack, or at least that's what they want you to think. Because in reality, it's more like finding a needle in a haystack that has just been eaten by a starving horse. Or put differently, pretty easy. This is because in all off-the-shelf locks, there's a way to get the pins stuck at the exact right height for the cylinder to rotate, without knowing it beforehand. And that's what lockpicking is. It works like this. You apply pressure to the pin by trying to rotate the cylinder. This is called tensioning. If you now slowly push up the pin stack, it will eventually get to the point it was made to open at. And because at that point, there's nothing stopping the cylinder from rotating, the cylinder can rotate. And you've just lockpicked a single pin lock. Now you might think that if you add more pins, there's never all that pressure on a single pin, right? So that would fix lockpicking. And while this is true in theory, in practice you get results like this. There's still only ever pressure on a single pin. This is because the holes the pins sit in don't actually line up perfectly. The reason being that we don't live in a perfect world. And if you ever want a chance at happiness, you'd better accept that fact. Anyway, this all means that off-the-shelf locks are, well, I wouldn't go as far as to call them festering piles of garbage, but I will go as far as to say they're suboptimal. And in theory, all we have to do to fix this suboptimal design is stop people from tensioning the cylinder while having access to the pins. Because without tension, the pins don't get stuck open. Now, channels like Stuff Made Here and Build Different Designs have already made some great unpickable locks by doing just that. The problem is, they're all really intricate mechanisms made from a bunch of precision machine parts, which isn't ideal if you want to make them yourself. So I followed the design philosophy KISS, which stands for Keep It Stupid, Simpleton. Now, what's the stupidest way to stop lockpickers like the lockpicking lawyer here? It's, of course, to stop them from accessing the lock.
Now, there are a lot of different ways of doing this, like building walls between the locks and the lockpickers, or by shooting the lockpickers when they get near the locks.
Those are not very practical. So I designed a mechanism that just blocks access to the lock when it's being tensioned, a lot like this piece of duct tape. This means you just have to build something in front of an existing lock instead of having to make all those complicated lock parts yourself. And that's exactly what I did. And in order to better explain to you how my mechanism works, I made this beautiful, transparent demo version out of heavily scratched acrylic. It works like this. There's an off-the-shelf cam lock with this red pin attached to the rotating part. This red pin sits inside a slot of this blue slider. This means that the lock has to rotate in order for the blue slider to move out of the way and let the door be opened. This green slider
is what makes the lock unpickable. Because if you try to tension the lock, the red pin hits the green slider. And as you might remember from 10 seconds ago, the red pin is attached to the lock cylinder. This means that the red pin takes up all the tension and no tension is being put up on all the pins, making it impossible to lockpick. But of course, a lock that doesn't turn is pretty useless. And this is exactly why this is a green slider and not a green stationarier. Because if you just slide it down, the red pin no longer hits it, and you can apply all the tension to the lock you would ever want. But if you look very carefully, you might notice that now the entirety of the lock is blocked. And you obviously can't pick a lock that you don't have access to.
It's really that simple. You can only access the lock when the green slider is up, and you can only tension it when the green slider is down. Obviously making lockpicking impossible, because you can never apply tension and access the lock at the same time. But if you're one of those keen-eyed viewers, you might have noticed a problem with this design, which is that if you were to insert a normal key into the lock, the handle part sticks out too far and stops the green slider from moving down. Now this would be a problem if not for the fact that this part of a key is actually entirely useless and just made up by Big Key to sell you more expensive keys. Luckily, there's an easy solution. Now the green slider isn't blocked by the key anymore. And so, you just insert the decapitated key, move the green slider down, and the lock's open. But now, you keen-eyed viewers might wonder, how do you get the key out again? Because you're definitely not going to do it with your hands. And this would be a problem if it wasn't for a little thing called basic tool usage, which even rats can do. And because I'm just as, if not smarter than a rat, this ends up not being that much of a problem. Now one of the best parts about this design is that it's super easy to manufacture, just consisting of a stack of flat plates, a decapitated key, and a cam lock. Anybody with some basic tools can make this design relatively easily. You just have to become one with your inner laser cutter and cut out some two-dimensional shapes. And that's exactly how I made the door to the small safe out of 6mm plate steel. I used a drill press, some files and an angle grinder to cut out simple shapes, and it works fabulously. As you can see, it's currently locked, and if I input the small key, it very satisfyingly unlocks, allowing the door to open. And I've got to say, it's worked wonders. In all the months I've had it sitting in my house, it's not once been lockpicked. But maybe that isn't very impressive, seeing as how, despite me always leaving the back door open, there still haven't been any break-ins yet. I guess I'm just unlucky. I also don't have any lockpicking experience myself, and asking a locksmith to pick it would involve me speaking to a stranger, and that's obviously not an option. This means my design actually hasn't been tested in practice. But when does practice ever differ from theory anyway? Though I have actually tested if it's possible to tension the pins while having access to the lock, and I've not found a way to do so. But as some of those keen-eyed viewers might already be typing into the comments, picking isn't the only way to open a lock. There's other ways that don't require tension, like decoding and bypassing, which I'll explain presently. Decoding is where you measure the height each pin can move up and fabricate a new key based on those measurements. We're looking at 2mm for pin 1, 3mm for pin 2. Yay, new key. This is not blocked by my mechanism because it doesn't require tension. But luckily it can easily be fixed by using a pin tumbler lock with differently sized driver pins. I just used this cheap wafer lock because I had it laying around and didn't want to spend my hard-earned Robux buying a new one. Then there's impact-based attacks. They work by beating the lock with a hammer. This might sound like something you'd see in a 5-minute crafts video, but this can actually work. It will go something like this. you would hit the entire lock with a hammer, and all the pins from the impact would jump up. And then as they fall, you apply tension to the cylinder and you've opened the lock. Now this could potentially bypass my mechanism, but because the lock is embedded inside the door and the door is fixed in place to the hinges, a very large impact would be necessary to move the pins even a little. And at that point, I don't think you can call it non-destructive anyway. Now another famous way to open unpickable locks is by skipping the unpickable lock entirely and just directly moving the latch or deadbolt. This doesn't work in my design because the deadbolt is directly attached to the lock. And surely no designer would ever forget about such a basic safety feature anyways. And then there's destructive attacks, which I did not bother with preventing because it's physically impossible to stop something from being destroyed. The only thing you can do is make it take slightly longer to destroy, and at that point, why even bother? Though I did add some of those dog bolt thingy-majigs, so that if you cut off the hinges, the door stays attached. Now if you know of any more potential ways to get this lock open that I haven't mentioned here, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear what some people who think they're more experienced in lockpicking have to say. All in all, I'm quite happy with the design. It has some flaws, like it has some happy little accidents, like needing pliers to get the keys out, and it not being strong against destructive attacks like drilling and forcing. But in the words of the most famous lock designer, this lock is like my baby. And babies aren't strong against drilling and forcing attacks either. And anyway, I didn't make this design to be the perfect unpickable lock. I obviously could have made it perfect, but like then people would have just thought it was AI. So I just made it the simplest unpickable lock instead. And I think in that, I definitely succeeded. And the basic premise of blocking access to the keyway before being able to apply tension, when it's refined and compacted a bit more, can definitely be used in all sorts of other applications, for when you need a cheap, secure lock that doesn't require electricity. So, if you need an unpickable lock for your doomsday bunker, which, looking at the current geopolitical state of the world, you probably need to finish ASAP, feel free to use this type of design. Though I don't recommend carbon copying this exact design, because I made it specifically for the form factor of the little safe. So, you'll be better off just designing your own. It's really pretty simple. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope it was an entertaining video, and see you next time.